Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight we have a meeting on a topic which I'm sure lots of you will hopefully be already either using AI or wanting to use AI within your beef herd. So tonight's title is Boosting Herd Productivity, Leveraging AI and Semen. So tonight we've got Professor David Kenny. He is the head of Chuggus Animal Bioscience Research Development in Ireland, Research Department in Ireland. He has many years of experience in research, well over 25, and he works with a lot of PhD and MSc students every year. He also, I don't know how he has time to do it all, but he is president of the British Society of Animal Science and the Physiological Study Commission of European Association of Animal Production. He is also coordinator for a €5 million Horizon Europe project called Towards Sustainable Livestock Systems, and he's won many awards for his outstanding contributions to the industry. At home, he also farms both beef and sheep in County Mayo in west of Ireland. And without further ado, I'll pass you over to David so he can share his knowledge with you all. And hopefully, obviously, if you've got any questions, if we can just keep the questions till the end so David can get through the various slides as he might be coming on to the thoughts you've got. But if you wanted to either jot them in the chat so you don't forget if there's a question that you're thinking of, or just jot it down and then we'll do all the questions at the end. So thank you very much, David. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Katie, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to get the chance to have a talk to you this evening on a subject that's very close to my heart in terms of, I suppose, reproductive management of beef cow herds, and particularly would say with emphasis on AI. So I'm just going to, I suppose, share, from a very practical perspective, would say some of the work that we've done ourselves, other work would say, done by other colleagues would say that might be of relevance to the discussion. And again, as Katie said, very happy to take any questions or comments or criticisms or whatever you might have, would say, at the end of the presentation. So without further ado here, I'll just try and share the screen, and then we'll get going. Sorry, no.
Hasn't shown it in slideshow mode, David.
Okay. We'll just try that again now, Katie, and I'll go back to how I tried it before. So should be able to.
We did just have a minor technical trial with this, but hopefully, yay, that's it. We've
great
solved it.
Yeah, no,
brilliant.
That's perfect. Okay, so we'll get going. As Katie said there, I work for Chuggus, and for those of you that are not aware, Chuggus is the national authority in Ireland for agricultural and food research, extension, or knowledge transfer and education. So we cover, would say, I suppose, livestock, would say, research and advisory services would be our biggest element. But we cover all the main, I suppose, sectors within agriculture. So I'm going to, Katie asked me to maybe talk to you about, would say, the use of AI in particular, would say, and in general, I suppose, reproductive management of beef cow herds, with, I suppose, I'll refer also, would say, to, I suppose, the possible use of sex semen, because again, obviously, it's something that's come more to the fore, even though sex semen has been around, for all of my research career and before it. But it's really only in the last 5 or 10 years, would say, in the UK and Ireland that it's really kind of got traction, particularly, would say, in beef cow herds. So I'll just try and move on there, Katie. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so just to give you an overview then, I'll give you a very brief background while we're even talking about this reproductive efficiency of beef cow herds. I suppose, go through very briefly some of the main elements of that. The intra-calf and interval, or what we call this 365-day or 12-month calf interval between when a cow calves this year and when she calves again next year. It's absolutely critical, obviously, we'll say, for economic and biological efficiency of a suckler herd. The calf, the cow, The calf is is the only output really from the cow other than when she's culled herself. And what we need, her biological, I suppose, capacity is to rear a calf every 12 months. We don't really ask her to do that, in less than 12 months, but certainly every day she goes beyond the 365 days of the 12-month interval, she's costing us money, and mainly in terms of feed costs. So anything we can do to try to shorten that and ensure if she calves down, the end of February, beginning of March, this year in 2025, that she's going to be calving within a few days of that the following year, and not extending on for 3-4 weeks, which is often the case, with say, unfortunately, with a number of cows. Um, as I say, I'll talk about the use of AI and why I suppose we might consider using it, certainly within, a proportion of our herd at least. I'll also talk a little bit about bull fertility, because obviously the vast majority of calves in the UK and Ireland are born through natural service. And even where AI is being used, in most herds, there'll be a clean-up bull as well. So it's important just to be conscious of that. And while we're only starting really into the calving season in many herds, that'll quickly be followed again, by the breeding season. And with bull fertility, we need to try to set up that bull, we'll say, well in advance of the breeding season, to ensure that we don't have any disasters later in the year. And then try to provide you with some summary and conclusions. So just, I suppose, to focus it again, unfortunately, we're all battered now with, I suppose, carbon footprints and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the whole lot. And obviously beef would say, has been under the spotlight a lot in terms of its contribution, in terms of methane gas production, would say, by the cattle themselves, and its potential contribution to global warming. Um, and like we know, if you look at the slide here, would say there that when we look at the main, I suppose, livestock derived um, food products, beef in general would have, one of the higher carbon footprints. But again, there's massive variation there, and the one thing we will say is that when you compare like with like, and they often talk about the feed versus food debate. In most cases with beef cattle, and particularly suckler cows, most of what they consume through the year is not in direct competition with humans. So in other words, they're eating very little, we'll say, grain, we'll say, or other products, I suppose, that humans will say could consume. So when you express the carbon footprint, we'll say, I suppose, per unit of human utilizable feed or food, we'll say their carbon footprint is much better than we're led to believe. But again, it's something that we need to, I suppose, it's like the old adage, when you're explaining, you're losing. So we just need to be conscious of it, and we need to try to, I suppose, reduce emissions where at all possible. And in general, the more technically efficient we are at farm level, obviously that's the best, we'll say, approach for economic efficiency. But also it goes hand in glove also with in terms of reducing methane gas, because that's just a waste product, in the digestion of feed by the animal. So feed being the biggest cost by far, probably 60 to 70% of the costs of producing a finished animal, or indeed maintaining a suckler cow. Anything we can do to reduce methane gas will mean that more of the feed that we're paying for and the cow is consuming goes to productive processes like, maintaining body condition score, or, producing milk, or supporting the fetus in our womb. So then, just in terms of productive efficiency, the lifetime of the cow is going to begin, we'll say, with the onset of puberty. That's when she becomes having her normal, I suppose, heat cycles. And after that, then, age of conception. So in other words, when is she bred and conceives and become pregnant first? Um, when she cares for the first time, that's really when she starts, making us money. We've held her in many cases for 2 years, and unfortunately, in a lot of herds, up to 3 years before she has a calf. That comes with a significant feed cost. Um, and she's taken up the room, more or less, would say, of a more productive animal. So the earlier we can get her calved and rearing, a calf, would say, and essentially returning, would say, on our investment, the better. Um, and we'll talk very briefly about that. The duration of the postpartum interval, and when I say the postpartum interval, it's just a technical term for the length of time between when the cow calves and when she starts cycling again. So that's a bit, that's the main, I suppose, phase or period for the suckler cow compared to a dairy cow. In that, generally speaking, the dairy cow, because she doesn't have a calf suckling on her, she'll be back cycling again normally after about a month after calving. Okay, and her biggest problem often, we'll say, is conception rate or pregnancy rate after that. In other words, that she needs to be bred more times, generally, we'll say, to become pregnant than the suckler cow. The suckler cow, her biggest issue is the delay between when she calves and when she actually has her first heat. Once they start cycling, they normally would say have fairly good conception rates and pregnancy rates thereafter. So again, anything we can do to shorten this interval more or less postpartum or after calving, to when this cow starts cycling normally again and we're able to breed her, obviously will help us to maintain that 12-month calving cycle. And obviously within, she needs to produce a good calf, would say, rear that calf well in terms of milk, and have a high weaning weight. And it's going to ultimately her worth will be, we'll say, manifested as the calving interval, the number of calves that she rears, would say, during her lifetime, and obviously the weight of those calves, would say, at each weaning. So there's some of the key reproductive targets, and it's like any business will say we need to set out the targets in, and we have to try. We have something then, I suppose, then to measure with how the herd is progressing. So as I said already, a 12-month or 365 day calving interval is absolutely paramount, because anything beyond that then is cost of money, in terms of feed and other costs. That less than 1 in 20 cows would be culled annually as barren. Now, they'd be culled for lots of other reasons, because maybe you're not happy with their milk yield or their quality of the calf, or there's issues with their docility, their temperament, or whatever else. But in terms of barrenness, or infertility, that less than 1 in 20 would be culled for that reason. That more than, I suppose, 95% or only less than 1 in 20 would not win a calf, would say, because obviously, as I say, that's their only job in life, really. Um, that you'd have a compact calving, ideally, would say, with about 80% of the cows calved. And again, this is, I suppose, for spring calving herds. And again, obviously, from an Irish perspective, and many parts of the UK, that's really the main show in town. Where you're kind of trying to calf your cows, would say, to the onset of grass growth, maximize the amount of grass forage, would say, in the diet of the cow, and obviously the young calf, the pre-wean calf as well. And the tighter that period is, um, obviously it goes without saying, the less period time you're spent with, say, calving cows, the longer that goes on, the more issues there are with build up of disease, would say, the more, I suppose, or the less uniform your calf crop is. Also jobs like whether it be disbudding or other castration or whatever else, you have different batches of calves, would say. So obviously the tighter it is within reason, particularly for a seasonal breeding herd, would say, the better. Replacement rates then somewhere in the region of about one, in every 6 years, would say the cow will be replaced. You obviously need to replace the cows on a reasonable regular basis anyway, for various reasons, and also for genetic progress. So you'd hope that, every number of years, would say that I suppose the genetic merit, would say, of the bulls that are out there, the sires of the replacement heifers, is improving. As I mentioned already, heifers calving at 24 months of age, all the information that we'd have ourselves here in Ireland, any of the data would say coming from the UK, and equally throughout the world, the US and other places that have done a lot of work on this. When they compare heifers calving at 2 years of age versus 2.5 or 3 years of age, and you look at all the figures, would say, across the board, and also the not alone the financial, would say, returns, but also the longevity of the cows in the herd. The advantage is always there for the heifers that calf at 2 years of age. But obviously, it takes good management to ensure that they're eligible for breeding at about 15 months of age, become pregnant, and then calf down, we'll say, 9 plus months later. And the other point of that sentence there was early in the calving season. Ideally, what you want is your heifer cycling well in advance of the start of the breeding season, that they're bred at the very beginning, a high proportion, because they should be cycling, and they will have a higher conception rate in normal, generally speaking, than cows. So a high proportion of those should be bred and, I suppose, pregnant in the first 3 weeks of the breeding season, and certainly the first 6 weeks. Because one of the problems with heifers, because they're still young, they're rearing the calf, their bodies are growing, and even if the calf down at 3 years of age, it's still the same thing. Um, and they will have on average higher calving difficulty than a cow. And again, regardless of whether the calf at 2 years or 3 years of age, they're typically going to take a bit longer to become pregnant in their as second calvers, or as first calvers, would say, going to become second calvers. So you do need that. You don't want to be calving those down at the end of the breeding season, or into the calving season, I should say, or getting them pregnant at the end of the breeding season. Ideally, they should be calving in the first 3 to 6 weeks of the calving season, so they have that little bit of time to still maintain their position within the herd. And obviously, the focus of a lot of the discussion here is optimal use of AI, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So there's many factors that affect the reproductive efficiency of a suckler herd, but we can kind of whittle them down to three main events or three main issues. So the first is age of puberty, or in other words, when those heifers start cycling and they're eligible to be bred. So that, as I mentioned already, is going to dictate whether you can breed them, would say, at 15 months of age to calf down at 2 years of age. And if they go, if it takes your herd, your heifers, they're not starting on average, would say, to become pubertal until well after that. Well, then obviously they're going to be a lot older before they start becoming pregnant and calving down and actually returning on your investment. So we'll talk a little bit about that first, and I'll talk about the other two issues then after that. So puberty in heifers, as I said already, is the definition of it is the onset of sexual maturation or maturity. It's a major factor, or there's many factors that affect it. The breed, obviously, the more continental or larger size animals, generally on average, are a bit later, a bit older, would say, when they start becoming pubertal. The play in nutrition, particularly early in life, particularly we find, would say, in the first 8 months, right? And certainly that period, would say, towards before the calf is weaned and maybe the first month afterwards, potentially before they're housed for spring calf and herd. It's really key that they're growing well, they're a good weight for age at that stage. Okay. Um, Heterosis or crossbreeding would say, generally speaking, crossbred heifers will be pubertal start cycles earlier, would say, than a purebred animal. There's also some evidence that if you have a bull pinned in the same shed or in close proximity to heifers, once those heifers are in good condition, they're well grown for age, it can bring them forward by a few weeks in terms of age at puberty. And we see the same thing with cows. But again, the key thing is that those animals are in good condition. Having the bull in the same shed or pinned, in a paddock beside the cows or whatever, um, if they're in poor condition, it'll have no effect in terms of inducing them into cyclicity. It's also moderately heritable. In other words, genetics plays a role, and obviously we can breed, would say, for heifers that that come into puberty or become sexually active, would say, or eligible for breeding at an earlier age as well. This is just showing, we'll say, there some work we did ourselves there a number of years ago, where we looked at the effect of puberty status. In other words, were the heifers cycling at the start of the breeding season or not? And we found, we'll say, there, if they were, then a much higher at each time at 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and 12 weeks of breeding, that a much higher proportion of them were pregnant than that cohort of heifers, would say, that weren't breeding, weren't pubertal at the start of the breeding season. So again, straight away you can see there, a significant number, certainly up to the 10 weeks, would say, of breeding. And again, in a much larger data set from the States there, where they retrospectively looked at it, they found exactly the same thing. Again, looking at the one criticism we'll often get from farmers, would say, is that, if I breed these heifers to calf at 2 years of age, they're not going to last in the herd. Okay. So when we look at, we've on our Irish Cattle Breeding Federation database, we have millions and millions of records, would say, on calvings and age, birth dates and all that kind of thing, would say, in suckler herds. And equally, when we look at the States, we'll say, and indeed AHDB data, would say, from the UK, and you look at, would say, the length of time, when the age of heifers when they calf, and how long do they stay in the herd after that. And this is just a bit of work there from the States. And as I say, our own data and your own data, would say, there from AHDB, would say the same thing. And they looked here at this specific trial, would say there's a good number, probably a good few thousand heifers in this data set. They compared heifers that became pregnant in the first, I suppose, 3 weeks more or less of the breeding season, and then all heifers more or less after that. And they found this is in a situation where all heifers were going to be bred, or they tried to breed them to calf at 2 years of age or close to it. And they found those heifers that calved in the first, or that were bred, sorry, would say, in the first 3 weeks of the breeding season, that that by four calvings later, that 50% of them were still in the herd, whereas those that were bred and they were beyond 3 weeks, they took more than 3 weeks, in other words, to get them pregnant, as heifers. That only about half that, would say, or 25%, were still in the herd by the fourth calving season. So that again just shows, because we know that because fatness and the ability of the animal to retain fatness has a major influence on both when they start cycling as heifers, but also when they start cycling as, after calving, and those two things are related. So a cow that can retain fat, or build fat reasonably quickly, that animal has a better chance of coming back into season or into cyclicity earlier after calving. So then moving on to this postpartum interval, or the length of time between when the cow calves and when she starts cycling again. Again, the big, I suppose, issue for the suckler cow compared to the dairy cow. And the longer that is, that's where the cow falls down, and you see these cows having long, periods between calvings, and it's generally because of the length of time that it takes her to come back cycling again, more so than poor pregnancy rates or conception rates. So I won't go into the detail of this. This is just to show, and again, Katie is recording this, so anybody can go back and look at the detail of any of the slides. But it's just to say that for dairy cows, generally speaking, most of them, if they're in reasonable condition, will be cycling again after about maybe a month, 25 to 30 days after calving. But for the dairy cow, they will generally take more services on average to become pregnant. Whereas with the suckler cow, they can be anything up to 3 months, 4 months, would say, if they're in poor condition, particularly at calving, before they start cycling. So straight away, then you're under pressure, would say, you're not going to meet your 12-month calving interval. And the main contributor to that is the presence of the calf. So the cow has evolved over thousands of years, would say there, to not to be bred too early after calving. Okay, so the fact that the calf is suckling on the cow, sends back, I suppose, negative feedback to the cow's brain to stop the cow cycling too early. But at the same time, we know, would say, if the cow is in good condition, that period can be shortened significantly. So this slide here just very simply looks at two cows essentially. One that didn't take that long, we'll say, to come back cycling again after calving. So again, about 2 months later, she has her first heat. Okay, and then compared to another cow here that took another 3 weeks or so longer, we'll say, to start cycling. And you can see here with the first, within the context of I suppose, a 365-day calving interval, the first cow here will have two opportunities to be bred, and taking a normal kind of gestation length of about 288 days for a continental type sire, that cow will calf again, or should calf again, more or less the same day the following year. Okay, the same date the following year. Whereas the cow here will say that, and she'll have two options or two opportunities to be bred. Whereas this other cow here that took about 3 weeks longer to have her first heat, well, she only has one opportunity. If she doesn't become pregnant at that first heat, well, then unfortunately her calving date is going to slip by the same amount, by 3 weeks essentially. And that's, she has to hold at this. If she breaks again, well, then that's another 3 weeks to 6 weeks. And your that cow is push, is costing money, because if she's feeding you, she's been or fed there dry, we'll say, and she's not rearing the calf during that period. This is just again looking at a lot of the studies we did ourselves and other European studies there, at the different factors that affect, I suppose, the length of time it takes the cow to come back again cycling after calving. The main one is the body condition score, or the level of fat of the cow when she calves down. What you want is the cow to be, not to be fat, not to be thin, but to be in moderate condition. Okay. And I'm sure would say you've had lots of presentations and talks in the past, and body condition scoring would say from AHDB, would say maybe Katie as well, and other colleagues. But I suppose, just simply speaking, a cow that's in moderate condition, calving down, compared to a cow that's thin, will generally take about 2 to 3 weeks less time to start cycling again after calving. Equally, when we look at, we'll say, the effect, I mentioned already, the main reason the suckler cow compared to a dairy cow takes that longer, we'll say a month longer or more, to start cycling again, is the presence of the calf. Um, Now, for herds that are autumn calving, or that are very early spring, where the cows are inside for a period of time before they're turned out, you know, we can, by moderately restricting the calf, particularly any of you that have creep areas, that you can separate the calf out maybe during the day for a period of time from the cows. That will have an effect. It's a very sizable effect on, I suppose, shortening that period between when the cow calves and when she has her first heat. So the calves could be blocked out from the cows for a period of time once they're about a month calved. You don't need to do it before that, and you don't need to do it for very long. Probably about 2 weeks, the vast majority of cows will start cycling, afterwards. But it's just an option there for maybe autumn calving herds, or herds that calve very early in the spring and are not going to be turning the cows out, we'll say, for a number of months. And particularly maybe for those early calving cows that you might like to use AI on, where they're still inside in the shed and it's easier to manage them. And then the last one here is looking at, okay, if you have cows thin calving or maybe not in the optimum condition, we'll feed them extra, we'll say, after calving, bring them forward in terms of the length of time it takes them to start cycling again. It'll have a modest effect. You might bring them forward, by giving them the equivalent of about 2 kilos of barley a day extra. Um, you might bring them forward by about a week on average, but it won't have anything like the effect of having them in good condition or moderate condition at calving. So really, what you want to do is when the cows are weaned, any thin cows, that they get additional grass before they're housed. Equally, if you can, to pin them separately, we'll say, and maybe give them a bit of preferential treatment to try to bring up their condition score. Okay, obviously, very fat cows, they can be cut back a bit, would say, but the thinner cows, they need to be managed, would say, early in the winter period, to try to bring up their condition, because one condition score is equivalent to about 70 kilograms live weight. So if you can imagine that even if a cow was gaining at half a kilogram a day, which would be, a considerable, without, excessive meal being fed to the animal, a considerable performance, it would take about 2 months, would say, to put on a condition score on a thin cow. So then moving on then to the main crux, I suppose, of what we want to talk about, conception rate and the use of AI. So the factors affecting conception rate in beef cows, it's generally not the limiting issue. As I said already, it's the main issue with the beef cow is the length of time it takes her between calving and when you can actually AI her, would say, or breed her. Okay, not so much, would say, whether she become pregnant to any one insemination after that. So nutrition, is important, obviously, and the cows are I suppose, a steady plane in nutrition. So essentially, and it can happen any of us during periods of poor weather, even with the best grassland management in the world, we'll say there, if you get poor weather, low dry matter grass, cows are used to, would say, plenty of grass ahead of them, and all for whatever reason, would say that you go through a period of either drought, or heavy rain, or whatever it might be, when grass growth, would say, declines, or something happens that you essentially would say run out of grass for a period. Those cows that happen to be bred around that time typically will have a significantly lower conception rate than cows that are on a steady plain nutrition, essentially, would say, during the breeding season. So it's important to try to maintain the cows on a steady plain nutrition throughout the breeding season, if at all possible. Bull fertility, heat detection. Obviously, bull fertility absolutely critical for the vast majority of herds that are using natural service. Unfortunately, every year we hear of problems, we'll say, with bulls, and often it's not picked up until the end of the year when the herd is scanned. So it's really important, we'll say, to ensure early in the season that your bull, would say, is fertile, that your bull is sound of limb and foot, is physically able to capable to mate the cows. And just because he was okay last year doesn't mean that he'll be fine again this year. And obviously, for those of you that are using heat or AI for any period of the breeding season, heat detection is absolutely critical. And if you haven't the time or the facilities, or if it doesn't suit the logistics of the farm, to I suppose implement a fairly thorough heat detection policy, well then really AI isn't for the herd, other than maybe using some synchronization that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Disease, obviously, really important as well. There's vaccinations there for many of the kind of diseases that leptospirosis, BVD, and the like, would say that are known to affect fertility in cattle, and obviously genetics as well. It's like a lot of things. Fertility of cattle, would say, is under genetic control. So we did a survey there. We did lots of surveys, but we did one there, I would say, a few years ago. About 500 farmers sent in responses, just in terms of their views on lots of different aspects of reproductive management. One of them was around AI usage. We asked farmers essentially, do they use AI about, would say, and again, remember the herds in Ireland in general are relatively small. The average suckler herd, would say, is less than 20 cows. Um, and a lot of fragmentation even within those small herds. So about 65% said yes, about 35% didn't use it at all. What were the main reasons, though, for using AI? The vast majority, about 50% of them, said better genetics, as you might, and the choice of bulls. Obviously, we'll say, as we'd expect, was the main reasons. And other issues, we'll say, then around some farmers, particularly maybe young families, didn't want to have a bull around the farm, and but the choice of bulls and the quality of I suppose bulls were the main reasons. For those that weren't using AI, then obviously labour, heat detection, a big one, massive one, would say. The drafting of the cows, would say, for AI, land fragmentation, would say again, a big issue in Ireland. Maybe not having good facilities on outblocks of land. They're all, for very good reasons, would say the reasons why some people didn't have or didn't consider or didn't use AI. And then we asked them also then if there was a good synchronization program available, which we validated and could stand over, would they consider using it? Would say maybe AI's a portion of the herd, and a good proportion of them said they would, and a decent proportion said if once they got more information, they might consider it as well. Very few wrote it off altogether. So then, why would we use AI? Would say then in a beef herd. So I suppose the benefits, and you'll all, I'm sure, agree to some extent. Would say there that 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 in terms of genetic progress, we have, in general, on average, would say the AI bulls should be better, would say, or at least there's more information and more reliability around than your average stock bull on a farm. But despite this, whether it's in the UK or it's in Ireland, less than 20% of calves born into suckler cows are bred from AI sires. So vast majority from a natural service. So it is a cost-effective way to speed up essentially genetic progress. It also obviously would say avoids the hazard, maintenance of stock bulls, where that's an issue. Um, and particularly would say the use of it to produce replacement heifers. That's where I'd see a role for it in every herd essentially, because it allows farmers would say maybe to pick out their best cows. Would say maybe either through heat detection or synchronization, breed those to AI. Maybe use sex semen to breed females, and then focus if they're buying bulls, just focus on the terminal traits for those bulls. They don't need to be worried then about the progeny of those, or is that bull good enough to produce heifer replacements. So that would be certainly one avenue, and also maybe you could decide to use AI on your heifers. And in general, like the dairy, or I suppose our dairy colleagues, they would often contend that the heifer crop should be genetically better than the cow herd would say in general. If you are making genetic progress, so our replacement heifers on average should be genetically superior to the average cows in the herd. And then if we maybe focus on those to use sex semen, generally speaking, the heifer calves are going to be easier calved as well, lower calving difficulty, and use them maybe and they're easier, they have higher conception rates to produce our heifer replacements to some extent, where it makes sense. Challenges in, obviously, as I mentioned already, heat detection, the labour of assembling cows, and facilities then maybe on outblocks of land. Then why would we use sex sorted or sex semen? It's become more viable in recent years because the quality, I suppose, the product that's available, we're getting higher conception rates now than what was available maybe 10 years ago. Um, and there's also now more bulls being sexed, or the semen from more bulls are being sexed than maybe in the past. Often in the past, AI centres only sexed, would say, baby bulls that weren't as popular. They had no problem selling the semen, conventional semen from the really good bulls, and they might have only sexed, would say, lesser bulls or other bulls. Whereas now, there's a lot more because it's easier and they get better conception rates and better returns of straws, would say, from those bulls. If there's demand there, they'll be sexing, their best bulls. And again, as I say, the vast majority of the calves, 90% plus, will be female calves. You can breed replacements early in the season, and obviously helps with genetic gain. Some of the challenges in the conception rate will be that bit lower because when you pass the semen through a machine, it's a laser machine, it does cause slight damage to the sperm. So as a consequence, then you don't get quite the same fertility. On average, it's about between 10 and 15%, maybe lower. But again, it's just really to focus it on a cohort, maybe early in the breeding season, we'll say, to breed the replacement heifers, particularly. So if you are using sex semen, then what you should do, I suppose, ideally, is to say the first maybe month or so of the breeding season is when you should focus it on. Because if you don't get maybe the best results, it gives you that bit of a window, we'll say, to make sure those cows do become pregnant reasonably early in the breeding season. Um, and you should really would say it's only really for farmers that have had good success in the past with using normal or conventional semen. Okay, good fertility in the herd, and that you're meeting most of those targets that I mentioned already in the herd. And choose the females carefully. The more fertile females, those that you'd like to breed heifers from, are generally the ones, obviously, that you use sex semen on. They want to be at least, would say, 5, 6 weeks calved, would say, as a minimum. And more, and ideally longer. That they have at least cycled once before breeding. Ideally those cows have been in the herd for a number of years, so you know that they're the type of animal that you want to breed heifers from, and that they're a good body condition score as well. Um, Obviously, when you are using sex semen, then choose it from a good quality bull with a high reliability. So there's a good chance that he'll breed the type of daughters that his figures suggest. Okay. Um, and then obviously would say, as you would with any bull that you use, would say, watch the calving difficulty figure, would say, really, really, really important, and that there is a high reliability associated with it. And then the other thing is, if you're not doing DIY AI, which most farmers won't be, have a conversation with your AI technician well in advance, and that you want to use sex semen, and make sure, we'll say then, that they have the straws available to you, and ensure that they're throwing out those straws, we'll say, properly, and there's no leg, we'll say, or time wasting between when the straws are thawed and when they're actually in the cow, because that's really critical. Heat detection is absolutely critical if you're using AI, regardless whether it's conventional or sex semen. And again, you have to put in a lot of time, would say. The more time you spend looking at the cows, the greater the chance, would say, of picking up all the cows on heat, and getting them bred, would say, within an acceptable window after when they start showing signs of heat, because that's really important as well to the success. I'll mention some of the heat detection aids in a moment. Timing of AI then with sex semen, because the product is a little bit less stable, we'll say, than your conventional. It doesn't last as long in the cow's womb, in the reproductive tract. So you need to delay the timing of AI when you're using sex semen, longer than if you're using conventional. The conventional can last longer within the cow's womb, we'll say, within the cow's reproductive tract, than the sex product. That's why it's important to have some estimation of when the cow started showing heat, so you can inseminate appropriately. And then, as I say, straw handling, very, very important, particularly with sex semen, because it is that bit more sensitive, we'll say, there, of a product. So you need to get it out, thaw it appropriately, and get it into the cow ASAP once it's thawed. Some of the aids to heat detection, tail paint, you've seen all these before. Scratch cards, would say, they work quite well, so long as there's no low-hanging branches of trees, or that kind of thing. Tail paint, as I say, works very well. The vasectomized bull works extremely well, once there's good libido. And then there's other electronic-based, would say, monitors, as there are, lots of dairy herds use them, would say, for detecting heat. This is just, would say, a picture, would say, of a group of cows here that were synchronized. They were all on heat. You can see they have the patches. Normally, these patches are silver in color, but as the cow mounts each other, would say, they rub off. They're like a lottery card. They rub off the silver coating, and the underlying color, would say, then is exposed, and it works very, very well. When the cows are well on heat, you'll see the underlying color very, very clearly. Vasectomized bull, again, as I say, once you use a chin ball harness, would say, which contains paint, and when the bull mounts the cow, it marks the kind of the shoulder area of the cow. Works really, really well. In fairness, a lot of usage within dairy herds in particular. Um, Obviously, would say, he's an intact bull. He needs to be managed the same as any other bull, would say, and you need to be very wary, would say, of using an animal like that. Um, and equally, would say, he needs to be just as his locomotion and his libido and everything else has to be the same, would say, as an intact bull, to ensure that he does the job as intended. Equally, often it's a yearling, year and a half old Frisian type animal, we'll say, that's used for this. They need to be big enough, we'll say, to cover your cows, so that 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 he marks them properly, we'll say, and that you can see, the cows have been mounted by the bull. Okay, so just a vasectomy, again, I just said I'd throw up a few pictures there of what it looks like for those of you. It's very quick, generally under a general anesthetic, would say, for the vet. Probably only takes, half an hour plus, would say, to do. So the vet, would say, will make a small incision, would say, just above the scrotum. He'll isolate, would say, on both sides. Um, he'll isolate, would say, the vas deferens, and this is just a little tube that carries the sperm, would say, from the testes to the penis, essentially. He'll isolate that. He'll cut it. He'll tie a knot to it, essentially, and he'll remove maybe 3 or 4 inches of it. Okay, and then that'll be sutured up again, and a check just to make sure that he has the right, I suppose, product. And then obviously would say, like any bull, that bull should be ringed, would say then, and the success of that would say is extremely well, once it's done properly as it should be. It's the animals work really, really well. And generally speaking, most dairy farmers anyway would only keep them for one season, just because in case they can, there's issues, would say, with docility thereafter. This table here just shows, would say, the relationship, and it's important, between heat detection rate. So in other words, I suppose the number of cows that you actually can physically pick up, would say they're actually on heat, versus conception rate in the herd. And you can see there, the higher the heat detection rate, so the more, when you go out looking at your herd, would say there, the more cows that you can pick up on average, the higher, would say, the overall pregnancy rate is going to be, would say, for the herd. And when you combine that then with good conception rates, then you can, that's where you'll get, your kind of, I suppose, 95% of your cows pregnant, would say, at the end of the breeding season. So again, as I say, unless you have the time and it suits the farm, would say, logistics, to put a lot of time and effort into heat detection, well then maybe AI, would say, traditional AI anyway, would say, is not suitable. So then the last part of the presentation then is just talk about, we'll say, synchronization, particularly for those farms, would say, maybe that heat detection don't suit. So again, as I say, it's a methodology of, I suppose, presenting a good number of cows for AI at the one time, but also for those late calving cows, it can be used, would say, to bring those forward, would say, and get them bred a little bit earlier as well. So again, I mentioned already, would say, there's a lot less AI being used in beef cows than there should be, really, would say. And there's a lot of synchronization going on in the States, and particularly in South America as well, would say there, and it works very, very well in large herds. So the main, I suppose, goals would be that the first thing that it would be that you can use synchronization for what we call timed AI. In other words, you don't need to watch the cows for heat at all. And most protocols now would try to incorporate that. That you minimize the number of handlings of the cows, because the cows obviously have to be treated, we'll say, with certain drugs to bring them on heat. But you want to, have no more than 3 handlings, would say, and that's including the breeding of the cow. And that it works well, in both cows that are cycling, but also cows that are not cycling. Because at the start of the breeding season, typically, about half your cows will not have started cycling again. So you need a protocol that works quite reasonably well, or quite well, in those cows that are not actually cycling. Okay, so I'll very quickly go through some of this. There's probably too much data in that. The protocols, again, very happy to go through the detail of them, what anyone will say afterwards. I'm not going to, there's no point, we'll say, for the interest of time, going through too much detail. But just to say that for the suckler cow, they will all rely on the use of a progesterone releasing device like a PRID or a CEDAR. And generally, you're talking about leaving those in the cow for about 7 days. And then there are other drugs used, would say, then to bring that cow in heat. Okay. We also use PMSG, would say, or have used it, would say, or ECG as it's called. Any of you that have sheep, either have ever sponged sheep, that's the drug that's typically given to use at sponge removal. And it has a role. Small amounts of it, would say, can improve, particularly in cows maybe that are not that awfully long calved, or cows in poor condition. It can help, would say, with conception rates. So then briefly, we did a large study there on about 2,200 cows, we'll say, there a number of years ago, where we looked at different protocols, all based around a 7-day PRID, and different, I suppose, interventions at the very start and at the end. And again, I'm not going to go into the detail of them, but just to say that all cows were fixed time AI'd 3 days after the PRID was removed. Okay. And the farmers didn't involve or get involved in heat detection. Okay, so essentially, either the vast majority of them had a technical service coming in, and they rang their AI man, would say, or AI technician, to come on a certain time or a certain day, and all cows that were treated were all bred to AI for this particular trial. We found generally, would say, as you might expect, that cows, would say, that were cycling already, they generally had a slightly higher, would say, pregnancy rate than cows that weren't cycling at the start. And we also found that even in those cows that weren't cycling, that the ECG or the PMSG, would say, did have a positive effect, as I mentioned earlier. Um, the other thing that we found, obviously, would say the longer the cows were calved, up to a point, up to about 2 months, the better the conception rates. And again, whether you're using synchronization or normal AI, that's what you'd expect. Up to a point, up to about 2 months, you'd expect, would say, that the longer the cows are calved, because again, there's a higher proportion of them going to be cycling at that stage, the better the conception rates. So then, just to summarize that whole trial, So as I say, we had 2,200 cows more or less across probably 60 or 70 herds. All AI, it would say, at fixed time without any heat detection at all, following that program. Um, After that, then, of the vast majority of herds, the bulls were turned in at about 10 days, maybe 2 weeks afterwards. Okay, so they bred the repeat cows then. And when we come back to pregnancy diagnose those cows then, on 2 occasions afterwards, and we combined the pregnancy rate, would say, with the fixed time AI, which on average was about 55%, of the cows that were treated actually were pregnant. And you combine that then with the pregnancy rate to the first repeats, essentially 3 weeks later, it meant that almost 80% of the cows that were bred, we'll say, or that were treated on the program were pregnant in the first 3 weeks of the breeding season. Okay, so that's the vast majority from the time DI, and a proportion then from the bulls, we'll say, that picked up the repeats. So like that has a major or potential for impact in terms of shortening up that calving interval, we'll say, the following spring. Cost then, again, I've just thrown up these here. That's what the costs were roughly at the time. You're talking about, we'll say, when you combined everything, we'll say there, including the AI, it was around 50 euros, we'll say. I think the exchange rate is about 120 euros for every pound sterling at the moment. So it might seem costly, but when you divide down the cost, we'll say take a moderate bull at about 3,000, 3,500 euro. We'll say 3,000 sterling price, an average price, would say, for a moderate bull. And typically speaking, he'll only last about maybe 3 years if you're lucky in the herd. Maybe covering about 30 cows on average, would say, per animal. And you take the depreciation costs, feed costs, veterinary costs, and everything else. We calculated there that the cost per calf was more or less the same, we'll say, for the stock bull as it was for using, we'll say, synchronization, we'll say, and AI. And again, obviously, the more cows you're breeding at the same time, the lower the cost will be per cow, we'll say, for AI. And particularly if you're using DIY AI, well, then it'll be significantly lower than that again. Heifers, fixed time AI, equally, it can work very well in heifers as well. And I suppose, but probably the cheapest way is use your prostaglandin, would say, based regimes, would say, with heat detection, because again, heifers will show heat more. They're more active, and generally, would say, speaking, they'll have about 10 percentage point higher conception rate than cows. This is just, again, this will be available. I'm happy to share this again. Some sex semen protocols for anyone that's interested in using the time DI, will say, protocols, synchronization for sex semen. And again, I suppose with sex semen, the key thing is really you should only breed cows with sex semen that you've actually seen on heat. If you're using synchronization, the best results with sex semen will be in those cows that actually show heat through the synchronization, as opposed to just doing time DI with them. So you'll get the best if you can put the time into for that short period, would say, of about maybe two days or so after you remove the prid or the cedar. Watch the cows, and I suppose target those cows that actually showed heat for the sixth straws. One thing the farmers often highlight, would say, is if I start using this time DI or synchronization, all this kind of, is it going to have an effect long term on my herd? So this is data here from South America, where there are thousands and thousands of cows. Would say there was, what, 23,000 cows there, and heifers that were AI'd, over a 10-year period. Every year they were synchronized and bred. And you can see there, year on year, the conception rates averaged from about 50 to 60 plus percent. No effect at all whatsoever, would say, of the synchronization regime on the overall, suppose, fertility of the herd. And again, because all you're doing is manipulating the cycle of the cow, it's not going to have any effect, we'll say, on any cycles she has thereafter. So, I wouldn't worry about if you do go in with a proportion of the herd using synchronization, it'll have no impact on the fertility of that cow afterwards. Uterine infections in and cystic ovaries often put down as a problem, we'll say, on herds. Generally speaking, when we went out to those herds, scanned all the cows before we treated them, it's generally a very low proportion of maybe 2 or 3 cows in every 100 might have uterine infection, suckler cows in a uterine infection, or maybe something similar, would say, in terms of cystic ovaries. So it's not nearly the product, the I suppose issue that's often, I suppose, blown up to be. And there's an industry there in some cases, would say, of like pre-breeding scans of herds and all that kind of thing. Definitely more of an issue in dairy cows, but in suckler cows, not a major issue. So I'll very briefly just finish off then as a bull fertility. Um, I mentioned this, a lot of this already, would say there. Bull, for the vast majority, would say, is going to be an extremely important animal, would say, in the herd. 50% of the genetics. We just need to be conscious that 1 in every 20 can be totally infertile, even if they were fertile last year. And more worryingly, about 1 in every 4 can be subfertile. So in other words, that's their ability to cover, a reasonable amount of cows will be compromised, or indeed they might be fertile for a period of the breeding season and be unfertile, would say, or infertile, I should say, for a period of it. And, even a small inflammation or a rise in temperature, would say, can kill off the sperm at that period. And it takes about 2 months for a new crop of sperm to develop that are capable of fertilizing the cow's eggs. Subfertility, as I mentioned already, really important, would say, and they're the bulls that are subfertile that generally cause the low pregnancy rates when it comes to scanning your cows at the end of the season in the autumn, and you have maybe only 80% in calf or less. It's often because of a subfertile bull, would say, and if it's an infertile bull, you'll pick it up a lot earlier. And just to be conscious then of young bulls, and the amount of cows that you can, or heifers you can run with a young bull. A mature bull will have about 10 billion sperm every time he ejaculates, would say. You know, um, you could, AI Central would collect about 500 straws from one ejaculate from a bull. Okay, and you can collect that bull on a regular basis. If you compare a young bull, he's only producing about a fifth of the sperm on average, would say, at every ejaculate than an older bull. And when those bulls are collected in the ice centres, they're only producing, is I say, a quarter or a fifth, would say, of the semen dose. So that obviously has an impact on the number of cows or heifers that you can run with a young bull compared to an older bull. Just coming very close to the end, case, apologies for I'm probably going over time. Um, the Some of the reasons we looked at, probably 3 or 4 thousand bulls, why they were, I suppose, culled in Ireland there a number of years ago, we'll say, as part of a government scheme, um, from herds, where farmers had to record the reasons why they culled their bulls. And you can see there that there was a lot of different reasons. But on average, the vast majority of bulls were being culled because of injury, about a quarter of them, or feet or leg problems, in other words, lameness. So when you combine those, almost half the bulls were being culled, not because poor quality calves, not because of infertility, or other issues, but because of injuries, would say, and lameness. So again, really important, would say, to make sure that you monitor, would say, the lameness, would say, and I suppose equally the housing of the bulls, would say, over the winter, because that's where when many of these injuries occur. And limb and hoof health is really important. We're starting a big project now in Teagasc, we'll say, in the next few months, looking at, I suppose, the rearing of bulls on different diets and its impact, would say, on things like laminitis, other inflammatory conditions, and ultimately joint health, we'll say. Because again, unfortunately, we know that a lot of these young bulls are reared on high concentrate diets for probably 6 months before sale, and we do know that if they're in a feedlot, that's going to have issues, would say, for lameness, would say, and potentially, would say, limb health and other things like liver abscesses and the like. So, it's important to try to establish, is there any relationship with fertility or indeed the longevity of the bulls. So then to finish up, the main take-home messages, I suppose, firstly, it starts with your heifer. Have her well grown, we'll say, at 12 to 13 months, to make sure that she's cycling, after 13, 14 months. That'll give you a good chance of getting that heifer bred at 15 months, and that she'll calf down, we'll say, at the start of the following calving season. Again, earlier you get in there, would say, to ensure that she's meeting her targets for body weight, would say, the better. That'll have a much bigger impact than waiting until she's 12 months before you start giving her maybe extra feed if she needs it. Okay. And obviously, as I said already, try to get those heifers bred in the first 3 to 6 weeks of the calving season if you want to make sure that they stay in the herd thereafter. Cows then, monitor the condition score during the last third of pregnancy and adjust feeding accordingly. Any thin cows, for whatever reason, they might have been lame, they might have been maybe extra good milkers, whatever it might be, try and give them preferential treatment, because it will, have a positive effect in the length of time it takes them to come back on heat again after calving thereafter. Okay. And then during the main breeding season, if you can at all, try to avoid fluctuations in feed supply. Heat detection is absolutely critical if you're using AI, and obviously for the vast majority of you, where you are using stock bulls, you need to be very vigilant, particularly of young bulls. Not alone, most of them will come, or a lot of them will say that they're being, I suppose, fertility tested, or I won't call it fertility, semen tested at sale or before sale. But that doesn't mean that there's issues with their libido, we'll say, or that they're physically able to bait a cow. So just don't assume that they're okay, because the fertility test, the semen test is really useful. But at the same time, all that tells you is that they have semen, they have sperm of that has good motility and they have enough of it. It doesn't mean that they're physically able to mate a cow or that they have that they want to mate a cow, that they have enough libido. So it's really in your hands then to make sure that they're able to cover those cows or heifers, and ideally buy them in plenty of time, test them out with a small number, and ideally get those maybe scanned a month later to ensure that they are getting cows or heifers and calf. And then if you're using AI or timed AI synchronization, there are simple low input, I suppose, protocols out there. They work quite well with fixed time AI, so you don't need to be watching for heat detection. And I suppose there are the slight modifications in for sex semen. As I said already, ideally if you're using sex semen, use it on the cows that you've seen on heat. Um, and or if your AI in cows would say without synchronization, delay your AI maybe by about 6 hours or so beyond when you'd normally air your cows. Okay, but none of these things are obviously a substitute for good animal husbandry and technical skill, and that's always going to be the fundamentals to any good efficient herd. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions you might have, and apologies for going over time there as well.
No worries. Thank you very much, David. Did you want to share
Yeah,
your slides
I will
and
indeed.
everyone, well, people that have got the camera on, you'll be able to see them.
Yeah, perfect.
Mike, did you want to come in and ask your question that you asked earlier on? If you want to unmute, just need to unmute.
Yeah, which one do you want? The first one or
the first one? Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned David. You mentioned age at puberty. Is that an indicator of the cow's fertility for the rest of her life? So is an early onset of puberty a sign that she's going to be more fertile for the rest of her breeding seasons?
Yeah, no, a really good question, Mike, because I think I just briefly alluded to, like, when we look at the records, would say, both at home in Ireland, would say, and also across the world, generally speaking, those heifers would say that become pubertal or start, would say, having their normal cycles at an earlier age. They're generally the ones equally that start cycling earlier after calving. And a lot of it is down to fatness. So heifers, and that's why you see differences, we'll say, between, we'll say, the traditional British breeds, they're generally fatter at a younger age than your continentals, because they're generally, as I say, they have greater fat stores, and the fatness triggers the brain more or less to start kind of normal heat, we'll say, cycles. And it's the same in a heifer as it is in a mature cow, essentially, we'll say. The cow has to hit, I suppose, a certain level of body fat before her reproductive process kind of starts in again. So it's not so much maybe the actual conception rate or the fertility, but it's more or less, I suppose, when they start cycling, and that obviously has an impact in on how many times you can get them bred.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Okay,
Perfect.
thank you. I guess it's more of a comment from Harry, saying that overfed bulls by breeders is a big contributor to culling as well. And if you've got
I
any
think you're right,
comments on
Harry.
that.
It's like we've done a lot of work now over the last, I suppose, 10 years or more, looking at, I suppose, different diets and its effect on fertility. But now what we're really looking at now, and again, because it's hard enough to get, you'll get funding, we'll say, money maybe to look at fertility, but maybe not so much, longevity afterwards. And but we are starting a new trial now, we'll say, where we're going to rear young bulls, we'll say, on different types of diets, either varying the amount of meal that'll be fed to them, or even within the meal, looking at, we'll say, a grain-based or cereal-based diet that would normally, have a higher, I suppose, have a greater incidence, maybe acidosis, we'll say, or an acid-based digestion, call it, we'll say, versus maybe more fiber, we'll say, beet pulp or citrus pulp based. Where you wouldn't expect the same, I suppose, fall off in the pH of the animal's rumen, we'll say. And to look at those, we'll say there to see is there any impact on the incidence of, would say, laminitis, would say, inflammation in the hoof, or indeed, would say, eventually when we slaughter those cattle, do we see any evidence, would say, there of issues, would say, with their joints? Because there was a study there completed there a number of years ago in Sweden, where they looked at I suppose 30 or 40 bulls that were culled from AI stations for subfertility, and they found that there was a high proportion of them had actually evidence of inflammation in the joints and joint damage. So kind of arthritis, more or less, would say, even though they didn't look lame, but at the same time, they were more or less kind of surmising, would say, that this might have been contributing, would say, to their poor fertility. Because, anything to do with inflammation, or indeed, would say, potentially rising the body heat, can damage the sperm.
Okay, thank you. Trevor, did you want to unmute and say your question, or do you want me to say it? I'll see if you unmute in a second, and if you don't, then I'll...
No, that's all right. No, I was tell I do a wee bit of AN for neighbours and stuff, and there's a fella asked me the other day to do some maiden heifers with sack semen, and he talked about injecting them. I estimate first, I was just wondering, would that still be okay with sack semen, or would you?
Yeah, absolutely, Trevor. Like, look at it. I think the key thing with the sex semen is, I suppose, ideally that that you've seen them on heat. And the main reason for that is that you can better then, I suppose, time the AI relative to when they started showing heat, because we do know, and will say that that the sex product, would say, doesn't last as long. It's slightly damaged, as it goes through the kind of laser, would say, the sexton machine, more or less. And as a consequence, then the more information you have, would say, on when those cows or heifers, would say, started showing heat first, the better you can delay that insemination for a better result overall. So absolutely no problem in the world using estrogen or prostaglandin, or indeed any synchronization regime. It's not going to affect the fertility. The biggest thing will be when you AI the time that you AI those cows relative to when they started showing heat.
Well, many hours after, if they locked the bull and then they were off standing heat, how many hours would you?
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll say, generally speaking, you delay it by about, we'll say, for example, with conventional normal semen, you'd say, we normally talk about kind of the 12 hours, we'll say 12 to 18 hours, we'll say, would be kind of the upper end of it, like, ideally around 12 hours. So if you see her in the morning, your AI would say late that evening, would say, and vice versa. Generally with the sexed product, you'd leave it off by about another 6 hours, we'll say, on average, if possible at all. So you're closer to that 18 hours, maybe even 20 hours, after they showed heat first.
Well, then that would mean if you were showing, say, on a Monday morning, you would nearly leave her almost a Tuesday morning sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so.
Well,
if once you were happy that that you were fairly confident when she actually started, that it wasn't Sunday night, more or less, would say. And I suppose the advice would be that if you're in doubt, you're better to use a conventional straw. Don't use a sex straw.
But you never ran into any issues with, like, heifer cervixes not maybe them not stand as well sort of that next day and stuff, and sort of maybe being a bit trickier to do after near 20 hours as opposed to 6 or 8 hours sort of after AA or after heat.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like generally speaking, like, look at the heifer is going to be always up more difficult anyway than a cow, like, to get going through the cervix. But at the same time, it shouldn't be an issue. Not in that interval. Obviously, if it was longer than that, she may well begin to close up again, or the mucus, would say, will be a lot less. But generally speaking, would say it shouldn't be a problem. But as I say, you really want to have a good handle on when that heifer started showing heat, would say, to be confident in using the sexed, would say, straw. If you're in doubt, would say, there, you come on a heifer there, you're not sure when she showed heat, you're better off to stick a conventional straw on her. So it just needs to be managed better, because look at yourself, it's a more expensive product. It's probably twice the and you know better than me, would say, twice the cost, would say, of the straw, at least anyway. And on top of that, would say it's a more fragile product in the first place. And there's probably more variation between bulls in their fertility with the sexed semen than there is, would say, with the conventional.
Yeah. No, thanks.
No bother.
Thanks, Trevor. Dowie.
Yeah, David, you mentioned on the AI protocols to aim for 3 handlings of the animal. But when you look
Yes.
at, there's countless protocols, and some of them you handle them more times, and they seem to show that you do get better conception rates from doing the little add-ons.
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest with you, it's a good question. Like, there's lots, geez, and particularly would say with some of the dairy cow protocols, you could be talking about 5 or 6 handlings, and like with the beef cow in particular, like we've done a good bit of work on it, and our main priority was trying to minimize those handlings, which would include bringing them together, would say, for AI. Oh, and in our experience, there's no advantage in going beyond the 3, because essentially what you want to do is you want to synchronize, would say, the follicles more or less, would say, and they're the little blisters more or less on the ovary that contain the eggs. You want to just synchronize the growth of that when you pull that braid, would say, you give your estimate, would say, your prostaglandin afterwards, that the cow is ovulating a good quality egg. And then, hopefully, we'll say, if Trevor or colleagues would say are inseminating afterwards with good quality semen, that you give it every chance, would say, of a conception occurring. I don't think there's any need to, make it more, more convoluted, would say, or more difficult than that. All you're doing really is just controlling the normal cycle of the cow. You're not adding in anything that she doesn't have already, essentially. But what
Yeah,
I would say is, look at the key thing, would say, it'll work better in cows that are probably closer to 2 months calved, would say, certainly 6-7 weeks calved, would say, than cows that are only very fresh, maybe 5 weeks. You need to allow the womb, would say, to involute or to heal itself fully. I wouldn't synchronize any cow prior to 5 weeks, would say, of or indeed breeder, would say, prior to 5 weeks, would say, and breeder at 6 weeks, more or less. Equally, it'll definitely work better in cows that are in good condition.
Well, I've no experience of cows. I've done a bit with heifers, and
Yes.
You do notice using a 5-day coasting protocol.
Yes.
The first standing heats will happen about 39, 40 hours, but
Yes.
some of them don't come on till 62, 64, sometimes 66.
Yeah, and you're
then
right.
You're struggling with 6 times. So I've gone away to now inseminating them twice to try and maximize the conception. And that's what I say.
Right.
The more effort you put in, the better
Yeah,
results.
well, in those short protocols that you mentioned there, those 5-day protocols, the key to success in those is the use of the prostaglandin. And the problem with those, we'll say, is that you need to use 2 shots of prostaglandin. You need to make sure that they're getting enough prostaglandin as well, we'll say, and that they're equally spaced, about 8 to 12 hours apart. That's the key, in that you don't. What often happens, and exactly as you mentioned there, would say, with that delay in when the heifer shows heat, is that the corpus luteum, that little kind of fat-filled body, more or less, that comes from, I suppose, the last time that the cow was on heat, would say, when she ovulates, you get this little, we'll say, small, something about, I suppose, 2 centimeters in size, that grows, we'll say, there in the place where the follicle grew, and that's what's producing your progesterone. And if that's not killed off properly, or if there's any delay in the length of time it takes, more or less, to be killed off, that will contribute, would say, to either heifers not showing heat at all, or indeed having a delay, would say, when they do show heat. So it'll be more, I suppose, variable with the really shorter duration protocols than if you leave the prid in for 7 or 8 days, for example.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I know you've got another question in the chat. I don't know if you've got another one as well, but if you want to do the 2 together, if it is 2 things.
Okay. Yeah, David, have you done any tests on the semen quality of AI straws? We've done quite a bit of testing this year. We found a huge variation, and these are coming from fairly major semen suppliers in the UK.
Right. We haven't really, like, I suppose, obviously, like, what we've done is we've done an awful lot of work, would say, on semen and looking at kind of different predictors of fertility, even in bulls, even where they've already passed, the kind of the lab tests within the AI Centre. So, like, in fairness to the AI Centres in general, they go through fairly rigorous, would say, testing of the semen before they freeze it. And again, would say they will take out batches once the semen is thawed to examine it again, like, you know. But even at that, you know, there's still going to be variation there, we'll say, between bulls, we'll say, in terms of the fertility of them. So, like, you could get bulls there that pass all those tests, you know, within the lab, and yet you could have anything up to 10, 15 percentage points, would say, in the fertility, would say, between bulls. So, I suppose different factors within the sperm itself, the motility of the sperm, how it, I suppose, interacts, we'll say, after thawing in the womb of the cow or the heifer, you know, all of those kind of things, we'll say. And obviously there's some genetic element to it as well, you know. So even though the semen passes, we'll say, reasonably rigorous tests within the ice inter, you know, they're not always a great predictor. They're more an insurance policy to make sure that there's no really poor fertility bulls. But there's still a fair bit of variation between bulls, we'll say, even those that have passed the those tests in the lab. And
Yeah,
obviously then on top of that, the thawing and the handling of the straws and making sure that the liquid nitrogen doesn't go below the threshold level, we'll say, and they can at any time, or any other issues, we'll say there, and the length of time, obviously, between thawing and insemination, would say, of the cow, releasing the semen into the cow's womb, all of those things in their own right, would say, will have an effect as well.
yeah, absolutely. Second question was on one of the last slides you said about was it restrict suckling help to bring heifers on back into estrus again?
Yes, correct. Yeah, so I suppose we did. Colleagues of mine did a lot of work going back, and equally in Scotland as well, they did a lot of work looking at trying to restrict. And again, I'm talking about a cow that's calved for a month, not before that. We'll say cows that are calved about a month. We'll say there, if you restrict the suckling. So in other words, just for argument's sake, you have a creep area, we'll say, at the back of the shed, or you know, the calves can be put out into a different shed where you're just breaking that bond slightly between the cow and the calf. That would bring the cows on heat, would say, you know, a lot earlier than if they're, you know, have full access, you know, unrestricted access to the calves all the time. And it's kind of like a halfway house between the situation with the dairy cow, you know, where there's no calf bond, there's nothing stopping her coming back on heat. That's why you know, the vast majority, unless they're really thin, the vast majority of dairy cows will have had a cycle by the time they're about 25 days, 30 days calved. Where suckler cows, the most of them won't have cycled by 6 or 8 weeks after calving. And the two main things that delay that are, number one, the calf, suckling the cow, and number two, the condition of the cow when she calved. So if you can do anything in autumn calving herds or early winter calving herds to kind of break that bond, you know, by preventing the calf having full access to the cow, or the cow having full access to the calf for we're only talking about probably about 10 days. You know, that will that'll induce a lot of cows to start cycling very quickly afterwards.
So keeping them apart for what, 3 or 4 hours, 6 hours?
Yeah,
12
so
hours?
exactly. If you could, you know, just for a sharp, and again, there's no point doing it until the calf, or the cow is calved about 30 days or about a month or so. There's no advantage in doing it before that. And generally speaking, if it was done, we'll say, in a bunch of calves, for example, for maybe 10 days, the vast majority of those cows will have a heat within 10 to 14 days after you started it. So
Right.
I suppose that's really, would say, where it works quite well, you know, in herds where you can do it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Has anybody else got any other questions for David? Nope. Well, thank you very much, David, for sharing your. Oh, Trevor has got a last minute question. If you just unmute yourself, carry on, Trevor.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to really turn into the debate, but then with the Northern Ireland having the sustainable ruminant genetics thing that's coming on, and it's going to probably be based quite a bit on the ICBF thing.
Yeah.
And the direction of the travel that the ICBF thing has had this last wee while, was just your thoughts on. And just the way I just launched the catalogue there with 13 limb bulls in it, and the 6 of them is the same sire or grandsire, and I was wondering, are they going to follow stars or follow easy calving, or what's the story?
Yeah, it's a good point, Trevor. And it's, as you might be aware, we'll say it's a major bone of contention at the moment with a lot of the breed societies. And there's a bit of a standoff between the ICBF, would say, and some of the breed societies, will say. And again, one of the arguments that they're putting forward is that because, I suppose, you know, there's such a big focus now, we'll say, on kind of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe, obviously easy calving is really important anyway, we'll say, regardless. But that we're kind of maybe to some extent restricting the gene pool a little bit. So the same sires and the same bulls, families more or less are coming up, we'll say, as topping the pole, essentially, we'll say, in terms of their genetics. And that concern is there for sure, that maybe we are kind of tightening the gene pool, a bit, in that there are, I suppose, certain families or certain bulls that are, that are coming out quite poorly, we'll say, on the genetic indexes. And because, as you know, in the south, we have, I suppose, for the last probably 7 or 8 years now at this stage, schemes essentially run by the government there to encourage the use of certain genetics, high maternal traits in the sire in particular, would say, in the cow. And that might have, would say, contributed maybe to a kind of a more constriction in the gene pool. So look, it's something that needs to be monitored, because it's really important to make sure that, while we have clear, I suppose, goals in terms of where we want to go with the suckler herd, that equally, would say, we don't restrict, would say, the genetic pool. Because if you increase the level of inbreeding, for argument's sake, would say, in the herd, and look, it's not such a big deal with sucklers because you have so many different breeds being used, as it might be, would say, with dairy cows, would say, where you're, predominantly Frisian. But it's still something that needs to be considered.
Okay.
Thanks, David.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for sharing your expert knowledge with everyone this evening. I think you must have given everybody some food for thought. There's definitely some bits and pieces within there that I've never sort of come across before, and I've obviously done lots of these meetings before. So thank you very much for sharing your expert knowledge and helping all of our farmers this evening. Hopefully everyone's got at least a couple of things they can go back and look at and try on your farm. And if anybody has got any questions that arise after the meeting, then do pass them over to me and I can pass them over to David, and hopefully we can get those answered for you. So if you do have any thoughts, then do come back to me and I'll try and get them answered for you. Thanks very much, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Yeah, thanks very much, everybody. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take
Cheers,
care.
guys.
All the best.